On December 30, 2006, Saddam Hussein was executed in an improvised room in Baghdad. What should have been a solemn act of justice became a sectarian spectacle recorded with mobile phones. The insults, chants, and humiliations were recorded forever. The execution did not follow international protocols. Witnesses shouted religious slogans while Saddam pronounced his last words. The leaked recordings showed a chaotic environment where exalted guards insulted the condemned. There was no judicial solemnity, only tribal revenge transmitted live. How did an official execution transform into sectarian lynching? Why did the leaked images alter forever the perception of the event? This is the story of the final moments of Saddam Hussein. Definitive fall, the dictator in ruins. For 24 years, Saddam Hussein had built a power system that seemed unbreakable. His regime, born in July 1979 after the resignation of Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, was cemented from its first days in the systematic elimination of any opposition. The purge, known as the Massacre of the Companions, executed barely 6 days after assuming power, established the pattern that would define his government: terror as an instrument of absolute control. The dictator had survived devastating wars, international sanctions, and multiple attempts at overthrow. The war with Iran between 1980 and 1988 left hundreds of thousands dead, but consolidated his image as an unshakable leader in the face of external adversities. Even the humiliating defeat in the Gulf War of 1991 did not manage to destabilize his internal control. The reprisals against Shiites and Kurds after the conflict demonstrated that his capacity for repression remained intact. The terror apparatus built by Saddam functioned with mechanical precision. The Judicial massacre in 1982, where 148 people were executed in retaliation for an assassination attempt, perfectly illustrated his methodology: collective punishment, exemplary terror, and elimination of any nucleus of resistance. His electoral referendums, like that of 1995, which granted him an impossible 99.99% of the votes, were not democratic exercises, but rituals of public submission. The American invasion of March 20, 2003, radically altered this power equation. The coalition forces led by the United States advanced toward Baghdad with a speed that surprised even the military planners. The regime that had resisted 8 years of war with Iran and the most severe sanctions in modern history began to disintegrate in a matter of weeks. The symbolic moment came on April 9, 2003 in Firdos Square in Baghdad. The statue of Saddam Hussein, toppled before the cameras of the entire world, marked the visible end of a regime that had dominated Iraq for decades. Although subsequent investigations revealed elements of staging in this event, its psychological impact was immediate and devastating for the remains of the governmental apparatus. By July 2003, the death of his sons Uday and Qusay in a confrontation with special forces in Mosul eliminated the last vestiges of dynastic continuity. Saddam Hussein, the man who had controlled every aspect of Iraqi life, found himself completely alone, reduced to issuing occasional audio recordings from hiding as the only means of communication with his former subjects. The months that followed transformed the omnipresent dictator into a fugitive. The American forces had initiated a systematic search that involved thousands of soldiers, hundreds of night operations, and an unprecedented intelligence effort in the Iraq War. Every day, dozens of raids were carried out based on fragmentary information, testimonies from former collaborators, and analysis of movement patterns. The operation that would finally locate Saddam Hussein was based on human intelligence techniques developed specifically for this objective. The interrogator, Eric Maddox, had perfected a method based on empathy and patience, getting former regime members to provide crucial information through prolonged conversations instead of aggressive interrogations. The information obtained led to identifying 2 specific locations near Tikrit, the dictator's hometown. These positions, codenamed Wolverine 1 and Wolverine 2, became the objectives of Operation Red Dawn, meticulously planned for days by commanders of the 4th Infantry Division. On December 13, 2003, Approximately 600 American soldiers deployed toward both locations. The operation involved specialized units of Task Force 121, air support, and a security cordon designed to prevent any possible escape. The coordination between different military units reflected the strategic importance assigned to this mission. The first searches in the two main locations did not produce results. However, near a modest mud hut, the soldiers located what would later be described as a spider hole, a hideout dug in the earth approximately 2.5 meters deep, ingeniously camouflaged and equipped with a rudimentary ventilation system. The capture itself completely lacked the drama that might be expected from the arrest of the world's most wanted dictator. Saddam Hussein emerged from the hideout without offering resistance, with an appearance that contrasted dramatically with the images of absolute power that he had projected for decades. His grown beard and disheveled appearance revealed months of clandestine life in precarious conditions. His response when captured reflected both his persistent megalomania and the reality of his desperate situation. By identifying himself as president of Iraq and expressing his willingness to negotiate, Saddam Hussein showed that even in his most vulnerable moment, he maintained illusions about his political relevance. The laconic response of the American soldier transmitting greetings from President Bush symbolized the definitive change in the balance of power. The elements seized during the capture painted the portrait of a leader in decline. 2 AK-47 rifles, a pistol, approximately $750,000 in cash, and a taxi that he presumably used for transportation. The presence of 2 bodyguards, also detained, suggested that even in hiding he had tried to maintain some structure of personal security. The total absence of violence during the capture was surprising for an operation of this magnitude. No shots were fired and no casualties were recorded, and testimonies from participating soldiers described Saddam as resigned to his fate. This attitude contrasted markedly with the image of epic resistance that he had cultivated during decades of authoritarian government. Operation Red Dawn represented the successful culmination of one of the most intensive military intelligence efforts of the Iraq War. Thousands of patrols, systematic interrogations, and night operations had finally converged in this specific moment, demonstrating the effectiveness of tactical persistence combined with precise human intelligence. The capture of Saddam Hussein symbolically closed a crucial chapter in the contemporary history of the Middle East. The man who had ruled Iraq with an iron fist, survived devastating wars, and defied the international order, ended his days of absolute power emerging silently from a hole in the earth near his hometown, completely alone and without the slightest resistance. Mortal trial, a sealed fate. The capture of Saddam Hussein immediately raised a fundamental question: how to judge a dictator whose decisions had altered the course of millions of lives. The answer came through a hybrid tribunal that combined elements of Iraqi law with international standards, a structure that from its conception would generate controversies about legitimacy, independence, and justice. The tribunal that would finally try Saddam Hussein was born from Order 48. Issued by the Coalition Provisional Authority on December 10, 2003. This directive authorized the Iraqi Governing Council to establish the Iraqi Special Tribunal, later renamed as the Iraqi High Tribunal. Its jurisdiction covered genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes committed between 1968 and 2003, creating a temporal framework that covered practically the entire Ba'athist era. The structure of the tribunal reflected the inherent tensions of post-invasion Iraq. Formally, it was an Iraqi institution, operating under national laws and directed by Iraqi judges. However, its creation under occupation authority and the international normative influence in its statute fed from the beginning questionings about its true independence. This duality would become a constant throughout the entire judicial process. The first major case presented against Saddam Hussein was the Judicial massacre, a systematic retaliation executed in 1982 after an assassination attempt against the then president. The choice of this case as the opening of the judicial process was not casual. Compared to the genocidal Anfal campaigns or the massive use of chemical weapons against civilian population, Judicial presented a more limited set of facts and more manageable documentation to establish procedural precedents. The oral hearing began on October 19, 2005, in an atmosphere of extreme tension. The courtroom, located in the so-called Green Zone of Baghdad, became the scene of a judicial drama that combined formal legal procedures with explosions of political rhetoric. Saddam Hussein, facing his accusers for the first time from a position of vulnerability, alternated between traditional legal defense and proclamation of his legitimacy as national leader. The evidentiary structure of the case rested fundamentally on official documentation of the Ba'athist regime. Signed orders, detention lists, intelligence service memoranda, and revolutionary tribunal records constituted an incriminating archive that traced a direct line between decisions made at the highest levels of power and mass executions in Judicial. This documentary evidence demonstrated that the retaliation had followed a planned pattern: mass detention of inhabitants, systematic use of torture and execution of 148 people after summary procedures. However, the development of the trial was marked by events that seriously questioned procedural guarantees. 3 defense lawyers were murdered during the course of the process: Sa'adun al-Janabi, Adel al-Zubaydi, and Khamis al-Obeidi. These crimes put in evidence the incapacity of the Iraqi state to protect the defense, creating a fundamental inequality in the process that international organizations denounced as incompatible with basic standards of due process. The most visible crisis of the tribunal came in January 2006 with the resignation of presiding Judge Rizgar Mohammed Amin. Public criticisms and political pressures for his hearing style, considered too tolerant with the accused, forced his departure in full development of the trial. His replacement by Rauf Rashid Abd al-Rahman, also of Kurdish origin and native of Halabja, fed perceptions of governmental interference and politicization of the judicial process. The procedural problems extended beyond security and magistrature changes. The use of anonymous witnesses hindered the defense's right of contradiction, while frequent changes in procedural rules and restrictions of access to the complete file created unequal conditions for the parties. These deficiencies led Human Rights Watch to qualify the trial as fundamentally flawed, without denying the gravity of the imputed crimes. The verdict was announced on November 5, 2006, on the eve of the midterm elections in the United States, a temporal coincidence that some interpreted as evidence of external political influence in the judicial calendar. Saddam Hussein and 2 co-accused were sentenced to death by hanging for crimes against humanity, while 4 others received prison sentences and 1 was acquitted. The appeal, automatically presented before the appeals chamber of the Iraqi High Tribunal, was rejected on December 26, 2006. The legal architecture of the tribunal established that the execution must be carried out within 30 days following, without possibility of presidential commutation. This rigidity in deadlines formed part of a more severe punitive design for crimes of this nature, but also eliminated additional safeguards traditionally available in capital cases. The execution of Saddam Hussein on December 30, 2006 became the most controversial moment of the entire process. The choice of the date, coinciding with Eid al-Adha, was perceived as a political symbolic error that added sectarian connotations to an act that should have been neutral from a religious point of view. The hostile environment that surrounded the execution, recorded in subsequent recordings, reinforced the perception that it was more about revenge than justice. The early death of Saddam Hussein had consequences that transcended his individual case. The second major process, centered on the Anfal campaign of 1987 through 1988 against the Kurdish population, was left without its principal accused. This campaign, which had included forced displacements, mass executions, and the extensive use of chemical weapons with the climax in Halabja, represented the most serious crimes of the Ba'athist regime. Although other responsible parties like Ali Hassan al-Majid were subsequently condemned for genocide, The absence of a personal verdict against Saddam for these crimes left a narrative void in collective memory. The question about whether the process constituted justice or revenge does not admit a simple answer. From the perspective of the victims of judicial, the verdict represented a judicial recognition of their suffering and a validation of their experience after decades of silencing. The documentation presented during the trial established in an irrefutable manner the existence of a systematic pattern of state repression, providing a crucial historical record for Iraqi memory. However, the procedural deficiencies identified by international observers eroded the legitimacy of the result. The incapacity to guarantee the security of the defense, the magistrature changes during the process, the use of anonymous witnesses, and the restrictions of access to evidence created conditions that did not meet international standards of due process. These failures were particularly problematic in a case that would result in the death penalty. The international community was divided in its evaluation of the process. While some governments officially backed the verdict as a step toward the establishment of the rule of law in Iraq, human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch maintained consistent criticisms about the procedural deficiencies and the application of capital punishment. The United Nations organization, although cautious in its official declarations, maintained its principled opposition to the death penalty. In the regional context, the reactions reflected the sectarian divisions that characterized post-invasion Iraq. Shiite sectors interpreted the execution as just retribution for decades of state violence directed especially against their community. Sunni sectors and part of Arab public opinion perceived it as victors' justice implemented under foreign occupation, feeding victimization narratives that would complicate national reconciliation efforts. The legacy of the trial of Saddam Hussein remains complex and contradictory. It managed to establish a precedent that even the most powerful dictators can face legal consequences for their crimes. At the same time, the deficiencies in its implementation provided lessons about the inherent challenges of transitional justice in contexts of active conflict and sectarian polarization. The tension between justice and revenge that characterized this process reflects broader dilemmas about how post-conflict societies should confront their traumatic past. The trial of Saddam Hussein demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of criminal justice as a transition mechanism, establishing an ambivalent precedent that would continue influencing subsequent efforts of transitional justice in Iraq and the region. As condemnation, the gallows awaits. The dawn of December 30th, 2006 marked the end of an era in the contemporary history of the Middle East. The execution of Saddam Hussein was not simply the culmination of a judicial process, but a deeply political act charged with sectarian tensions and historical symbolism. The last hours of the former Iraqi dictator revealed both the fractures of the new Iraq and the inherent contradictions of transitional justice in a context of occupation and civil war. The path to the gallows had officially begun on November 5, 2006, when the Iraqi Special Tribunal declared Saddam Hussein guilty of crimes against humanity for the Judicial massacre. The death sentence by hanging activated a countdown marked by internal and international political pressures. The Iraqi government, dominated by Shiite politicians after the invasion of 2003, insisted on executing the sentence before the Muslim New Year to demonstrate determination and authority. This urgency contrasted with American reservations, which feared that a hasty execution could exacerbate the sectarian violence that was already bleeding the country. Washington found itself in a delicate position. On one hand, it had backed the creation of the tribunal and wanted Iraqi justice to follow its course. On the other, American military and diplomatic strategists understood that the timing and form of the execution could have devastating consequences for regional stability. The final date was set barely one day after an Iraqi appeals court confirmed the condemnation, demonstrating the haste of Nouri al-Maliki's government to close this chapter. During the days prior to the execution, Saddam Hussein remained under American custody at Camp Justice, a military complex in North Baghdad. Although officially he was already under Iraqi jurisdiction, in practice it was the American army that guaranteed his security. This administrative duality reflected the broader ambiguities of the occupation, a nominally sovereign Iraqi government that depended on foreign protection to implement its most important decisions. The logistical dilemma was considerable. Transferring the prisoner too early could generate information leaks and coordinated insurgent attacks. Doing it too late supposed challenging the authority of a government anxious to project firmness before its own population. The Sunni insurgency had promised massive reprisals if the execution was carried out, while Shiite militias demanded that the sentence be fulfilled without delay. The transfer operation began in the early hours of December 30th under strict security measures. Saddam Hussein was conducted from his cell to an American military helicopter escorted by heavily armed troops. The ground convoy had been discarded due to the high risk of insurgent ambushes in a city where the roads had become daily battlefields. The air route offered greater security, although it did not completely eliminate the danger of attacks with portable missiles. The destination was the so-called House of Justice, located in the Kazimiya neighborhood, north of Baghdad. This building, a former Iraqi intelligence headquarters converted into a judicial and penitentiary center, had been selected for reasons both practical and symbolic. Its location in a zone of strong Shiite presence was not casual. It represented the sectarian power change that had defined post-invasion Iraq. Sources agree that Saddam was officially informed of his transfer few hours before departing. They allowed him to take with him a copy of the Quran, his only personal possession in these final moments. His reaction was of apparent serenity, without shows of panic or pleas for clemency. This calm contrasted markedly with the palpable tension among the American and Iraqi guards who were guarding him. The North American troops maintained the constant concern of a possible rescue attempt until the last moment. The military commanders had documented the persistence of cells loyal to Saddam in different parts of the country, and the possibility of a desperate operation to free him could not be completely ruled out. The Iraqis, for their part, were determined that the execution not suffer additional delays that could be interpreted as vacillation or weakness. The helicopter transfer to Kazimiya was carried out following carefully planned routes to avoid zones of insurgent concentration. The coordination between American and Iraqi forces was intense and meticulous. Once in the perimeter of the House of Justice, custody was formally transferred to the Iraqi government, a gesture that symbolized, at least in theory, that the final responsibility for the execution fell on the new Iraqi state and not on the occupation forces. Inside the building had gathered a select group of officials, guards, and authorized witnesses. Among them were representatives of the Iraqi government, judges, prosecutors, forensic doctors, security officers, and religious representatives. The composition of the group reflected the sectarian realities of the new Iraq. The majority were Shiites, some of them members of political parties that had suffered systematic repression during the Ba'athist regime. The atmosphere was charged with multiple and contradictory tensions. For many of those present, this was not simply a judicial act, but a historical revenge long awaited. This factor would become evident in the chants and hostile expressions that would later be heard in the leaked recordings. The fear of an insurgent attack remained latent. The American forces had warned that the execution could become a high-value target for Sunni armed groups loyal to the former regime. The control of information had become a central concern. Despite express prohibitions on unauthorized recordings, some witnesses carried mobile phones with video capacity. This violation of security protocols would end up generating the images and audios that would show the world the sectarian and chaotic character of the act, irreversibly tarnishing the international perception of the execution. The emotional tension was palpable in every gesture and word. For many Shiite officials present, Saddam Hussein represented decades of repression, torture, and death. His mere presence in the room generated a toxic mixture of accumulated hatred, anticipated relief, and procedural nervousness. The The American representatives, maintaining an obliged professional distance, observed with growing uneasiness how any pretension of judicial neutrality vanished. One of the most striking aspects of these final hours was the personal behavior of Saddam Hussein. Far from showing the panic or desperation that might be expected, the former dictator maintained a serene and even defiant attitude. Witnesses noted that he entered the execution room with firm step, refused to have his face covered with the traditional hood, and addressed his executioners with clear voice and without tremor. This behavior was not fortuitous. Saddam Hussein perfectly understood that his death would be observed, analyzed, and judged by supporters and enemies. Dying with apparent dignity allowed him to project a final image that would transcend his political defeat. His legacy strategy was based on becoming a martyr in the eyes of Sunni Arab sectors, who already perceived him as a victim of a sectarian conspiracy backed by foreign forces. The contrast between his calculated calm and the agitation of those surrounding him became increasingly evident. Guards and officials pronounced insults and sectarian chants, transforming what should have been a solemn act of justice into a manifestation of tribal revenge. The presence of American representatives, uncomfortable with the course the events were taking, evidenced the limitations of their influence in crucial moments. Before climbing the scaffold, Saddam was allowed to deliver the Quran he carried with him to one of the witnesses present. He was also offered time to recite final prayers. Unlike other condemned in similar circumstances, he was not sedated or forced to wear clothes different from what he was wearing. These details, apparently minor, reflected both the residual respect toward his former position and the urgency to quickly conclude the process. The corridor that led toward the gallows filled with murmurs, prayers, and sectarian slogans. Some present chanted the name of Muqtada al-Sadr, the young Shiite cleric who had become a symbol of resistance to American occupation and political rival of Maliki's government. These partisan expressions revealed the deeply political nature of the moment, destroying any illusion of judicial neutrality. In the instance prior to the activation of the mechanism, Saddam attempted to pronounce completely the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. However, the trapdoor was activated before he could finish the sacred phrase. This detail, recorded in the clandestine recordings, was interpreted in contradictory ways. Some saw it as a show of spiritual defiance until the end, others as an additional humiliation in a process marked by precipitation and sectarianism. The preparation for the execution of Saddam Hussein did not simply constitute the epilogue of a judicial process. It represented a cruel radiograph of Iraq in 2006, a country devastated by invasion, trapped between the heritage of a brutal dictatorship and the violence unleashed by a poorly planned foreign occupation. The last hours of the dictator revealed the sectarian fractures that would define the subsequent years, the limitations of transitional justice in contexts of active conflict, and the inherent contradictions of building state legitimacy under foreign military protection. The outcome marked not only the end of a life, but the symbolic closure of a historical era. However, the manner in which the sentence was executed revealed that the new Iraq inherited many of the problems it had promised to overcome: sectarianism, political revenge, and the incapacity to distinguish between justice and retribution. Final scaffold: imminent death. The dawn of December 30th, 2006 reached its culminating moment in an austere room of the House of Justice in Casimir. What should have constituted the solemn outcome of a judicial process transformed into a spectacle charged with sectarian symbolism and political tensions. The final minutes of Saddam Hussein on the scaffold would reveal both the definitive twilight of a dictator and the deep fractures of an Iraq torn by occupation and civil war. The execution room presented an almost deliberate austerity. The grey walls, poorly lit by irregular fluorescent lights, framed a wooden scaffold elevated approximately 1 meter above the concrete floor. The structure had been built with materials recycled from previous executions, a detail that reinforced the sensation of continuity between authoritarian regimes. The rectangular trapdoor, manually operated by means of a lateral lever, had been calibrated according to the weight of the condemned to guarantee death by cervical rupture, although the rudimentary construction evidenced the improvisation that characterized the new Iraqi judicial apparatus. The thick hemp rope descended from an iron beam welded to the ceiling, forming the noose that had been previously tested with sandbags of approximately Saddam Hussein's weight. The hangman's knot, tied according to traditional techniques, reflected a disturbing mixture between modern judicial procedures and archaic executive methods. The ensemble transmitted a sensation of precarious functionality more than institutional solemnity. Around the scaffold gathered between 20 and 30 people, an unusually numerous crowd for a judicial execution. The composition of the group reflected the sectarian realities of the new Iraq: Shiite governmental officials, judges, forensic doctors, religious representatives, and members of the security forces. The majority presence of Shiites was not casual. Many of them represented political parties that had suffered decades of repression under the Ba'athist regime. Despite strict orders about the prohibition of recording devices, several witnesses carried mobile phones with video capacity. This violation of security protocols, apparently tolerated by some organizers, would end up generating the images that would irreversibly alter the international perception of the event. The lack of control over these devices evidenced both the political urgency of the government and the administrative limitations of the Iraqi judicial system. When Saddam Hussein was conducted toward the scaffold, he refused the hood and maintained composure. The serenity of the condemned again contrasted with the exaltation of those present, although this time in an environment dominated by sectarian slogans. His last words, recorded both by eyewitnesses and by clandestine recordings, followed a clear strategy of legacy construction. He pronounced the Shahada, the Islamic profession of faith traditionally recited by Muslims at the moment of death. His voice, firm and without tremor, contrasted with the evident nervousness of those surrounding him. He also proclaimed pan-Arabist slogans, shouting references to Palestine and denouncing Zionism in a final attempt to transcend as a regional leader more than as a local dictator. As seen in the recordings, the trapdoor fell in the middle of the Shahada, which many interpreted as a sign of sectarian humiliation. The atmosphere in the room had progressively degenerated from judicial solemnity toward sectarian spectacle. Far from reigning the respectful silence appropriate for an act of formal justice, some witnesses began to shout slogans in favor of Muqtada al-Sadr, the young Shiite cleric who had become a symbol of resistance both to the previous regime and to American occupation. Others launched direct insults against the condemned, reminding him of specific crimes and publicly humiliating his figure. This conduct contravened all international protocols that recommend maintaining a sober and respectful environment during judicial executions. The transformation of the act into a manifestation of tribal revenge fundamentally weakened the legitimacy of the process. Instead of projecting the impartial authority of the new Iraqi state, the scene revealed the sectarian passions that motivated many of its representatives. The sectarian division, already acute due to the violence following the invasion of 2003, intensified dramatically with these images. For the Sunni community, majority in the Arab world but minority in Iraq, the execution confirmed their worst fears about the vengeful character of the new political order. The perception that Saddam Hussein had been executed not for his crimes, but for his sectarian identity would feed the insurgency and intercommunal violence for subsequent years. Some officials present maintained an uncomfortable silence, evidently conscious that the situation was getting out of control. However, their attempts to moderate the environment were ineffective before the exaltation of other witnesses. The presence of religious representatives, which should have guaranteed a minimum of spiritual solemnity, was counterproductive when some of them joined the sectarian chants. The leaked video of these moments, disseminated on the internet few hours after the execution, caused a devastating international impact. The images showed an almost festive environment among certain witnesses, destroying any pretension that it was an act of impartial justice. Even international leaders who had backed the overthrow of Saddam Hussein expressed discomfort with the specific form of his execution. The global reaction did not center on questioning the legitimacy of the condemnation, nor on defending the rights of the executed dictator. The criticisms were directed toward the lack of professionalism, the absence of solemnity, and the clearly sectarian character of the procedure. International human rights organizations pointed out that, independently of the crimes of the condemned, the form of the execution projected political revenge more than institutional justice. The serene attitude of Saddam Hussein during these final moments paradoxically contributed to the construction of his posthumous image as martyr. His capacity to maintain composure contrasted favorably with the agitation and hostility of his executioners. For Sunni Arab sectors and pan-Arabist currents, this difference in behavior validated narratives that presented him as victim of a sectarian conspiracy backed by foreign forces. The moment of the fall marked the physical end of Saddam Hussein, but simultaneously initiated his symbolic transformation. The image of the serene dictator facing exalted sectarian executioners provided valuable propaganda material for insurgent groups and resistance movements. The Sunni insurgency would use these scenes to recruit combatants, presenting the execution as evidence of the systematic persecution of their community. The immediate consequences of these final minutes transcended widely the individual destiny of Saddam Hussein. Instead of pacifying Iraq through a definitive act of justice, the execution fed the spiral of sectarian violence that would characterize the subsequent years. The perception of partiality and revenge weakened the legitimacy of Nouri al-Maliki's government and complicated American efforts to stabilize the country. The collective memory of these moments would remain permanently divided according to sectarian and political lines. For Shiite communities that had suffered systematic repression under the Ba'athist regime, the execution represented late but necessary historical justice. For Sunni communities and Arab nationalist currents, it constituted evidence of the vengeful and partial nature of the new Iraqi political order. The final minutes on the scaffold of the House of Justice thus became a microcosm of the contradictions that would define post-invasion Iraq. The austere physical space, the sectarian tensions among the witnesses, the calculated serenity of the condemned, and the subsequent filtration of images revealed the incapacity of the new state to distinguish between institutional justice and tribal revenge. The legacy of these moments transcends the individual biography of Saddam Hussein to become a paradigmatic episode about the challenges of transitional justice in contexts of sectarian conflict. The execution room not only witnessed the end of a life, but the crystallization of political divisions that would continue destabilizing Iraq for subsequent decades. Exposed lie, the truth revealed. The execution of Saddam Hussein inaugurated a new era in the relationship between technology, politics, and historical memory. What should have been a controlled judicial act transformed into an uncontrollable global spectacle when a clandestine recording made with a mobile phone completely contradicted the official narrative. The contrast between the edited version of the Iraqi government and the unauthorized images revealed not only the contradictions of the process, but also the emerging power of technology to alter the perception of crucial historical events. The Iraqi government had carefully planned the audio-visual recording of the execution. The official version, produced with technical support from American forces, followed protocols designed to project solemnity and judicial legitimacy. The authorities authorized a partial recording that included the preparation of the condemned, his transfer to the scaffold, and the placement of the rope around the neck. However, the exact moment of the fall of the trapdoor was deliberately eliminated from the final edition. This editorial decision reflected a clear political strategy. Nouri al-Maliki's government needed to demonstrate that the execution had been carried out according to legal procedures, but without exposing the explicit violence of the act. Instead, the official video showed the figure of Saddam with the rope and, after a strategic cut, subsequent images of his corpse wrapped in a white sheet. Iraqi state television disseminated this material the same day of the execution, accompanied by official declarations that presented the gallows as the triumph of justice over tyranny. Parallel and in direct violation of the established security protocols, one of the witnesses present had introduced a mobile phone with recording capacity. This violation, apparently tolerated by some organizers, would end up irreversibly altering the world perception of the event. The device captured approximately 3 minutes of material that included both audio and video of aspects that the official version had deliberately hidden. The clandestine recording revealed a completely different reality from that projected by the authorities. Instead of the expected judicial solemnity, the images showed a chaotic and vengeful environment. The audio recorded insults directed at Saddam while he climbed the scaffold, sectarian chants in favor of Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, and the voice of the condemned himself pronouncing the Shahada with notable serenity. Crucially, the recording included the exact moment when the trapdoor opened and the body fell. The clandestine video reinforced what was already noted. Saddam projected serenity, while sectarian shouts dominated the room, a contrast that weakened the official narrative. The dissemination of the clandestine recording began immediately after the execution. In a matter of hours, the material circulated through Baghdad by means of mobile phones and pirated CDs. The speed of propagation surpassed all historical precedents for this type of content. Arab satellite televisions like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya obtained copies and transmitted fragments, exponentially amplifying their regional reach. The role of the internet was transformative. The execution of Saddam Hussein coincided with the expansion of online digital video and the emergence of platforms like YouTube. Never before had a capital execution been so widely disseminated in an unofficial manner. The material was reproduced millions of times in days, generating global debates about justice, dignity, and sectarianism. It was one of the first cases in which a historical event went viral in real time, establishing precedents for subsequent events. The Iraqi government desperately tried to counteract the unauthorized dissemination by promoting the official version, but the damage was irreversible. The clandestine recording possessed a crude authenticity that the governmental edition could not equal. For global audiences accustomed to distrusting official narratives, especially in contexts of war and occupation, the unauthorized images seemed inherently more credible. The reactions in Iraq reflected and exacerbated the existing sectarian divisions. Among Shiite communities, the execution was celebrated as historical justice against a dictator who had implemented decades of systematic repression. In Shiite neighborhoods of Baghdad, celebrations were recorded with shots in the air and manifestations of joy. However, these celebrations, also captured by unofficial cameras, contributed to the perception of tribal revenge more than impartial justice. Sunni communities reacted with growing indignation. The serene and defiant attitude of Saddam in the recordings, combined with the sectarian insults audible in the audio, transformed him into a martyrial figure for many. The fact that the trapdoor had been activated apparently before he could finish reciting the Shahada was interpreted as a deliberate and sacrilegious humiliation. This perception fed narratives of systematic persecution that would justify years of subsequent insurgency and sectarian violence. In the broader Arab world, the reactions were equally polarized, but with additional geopolitical nuances. In countries like Egypt, Jordan, and Palestinian territories, significant sectors of the population perceived that Saddam had died with dignity facing sectarian executioners. Manifestations in Gaza and the West Bank exhibited photographs of Saddam as a symbol of Arab resistance. In Gulf countries, although governments maintained official neutrality due to their alliances with the United States, public opinion interpreted the execution majorly as sectarian revenge backed by foreign forces. The international community expressed growing discomfort with the specific form of the execution. Western governments that had backed the overthrow of Saddam Hussein found themselves in the uncomfortable position of defending a process that the leaked images showed as fundamentally sectarian. British Prime Minister Tony Blair avoided direct comments, while even in Washington, critical voices emerged that questioned the methods employed more than the political objectives. International human rights organizations were resounding in their criticisms. Amnesty International denounced that the execution recorded in a humiliating environment demonstrated the lack of impartiality of the judicial process. Human Rights Watch pointed out that the images confirmed the politicization of a trial they already considered deeply flawed. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions declared that the execution resembled more a lynching than an act of formal justice. The leaked recordings established a historical precedent about the power of mobile technology to challenge state narratives. A single clandestine camera had sufficed to completely alter the global perception of an event designed to demonstrate the legitimacy of the new Iraqi order. This case became the first of many subsequent examples where unauthorized recordings would expose contradictions between official discourses and realities on the ground. The episode also revealed the limitations of state control over information in the emerging digital era. Despite all the security measures implemented, the presence of a single unauthorized device had been sufficient to destroy months of political and communicational planning. This vulnerability would become a constant concern for governments facing similar crises in subsequent years. For the posthumous figure of Saddam Hussein, the recordings paradoxically contributed to a partial rehabilitation of his image. Although his regime had been marked by systematic repression and massive human rights violations, the specific manner in which he was executed repositioned him as a symbol of dignity facing humiliation. This phenomenon demonstrated how images can reconfigure collective memory, even when they contradict well-documented historical legacies. Al-Maliki's government was permanently weakened by the handling of the case. What should have constituted a moment of legitimacy consolidation became evidence of sectarianism and lack of institutional control. The incapacity to maintain the solemnity of the judicial process undermined subsequent efforts to present the new Iraq as a state based on law more than tribal revenge. The leaked recordings of the execution of Saddam Hussein marked a turning point in the relationship between technology, politics, and historical memory. The contrast between the official version and the reality captured clandestinely exposed not only the contradictions of the judicial process but also the fragility of state attempts to control narratives in the digital era. The mobile phone in the execution room defeated years of governmental planning, demonstrating that even the most controlled acts can become completely uncontrollable spectacles. Ultimately, these recordings transcended their documentary function to become symbols of the deeper tensions that would define post-invasion Iraq. They did not simply document an execution, but revealed sectarian fractures, the contradictions of occupation, and the transformative power of images to mold historical understanding of crucial events. Total ruin, Iraq in the abyss. The execution of Saddam Hussein should have closed a traumatic chapter of Iraqi history and inaugurated an era of national reconciliation. However, the specific manner in which the execution was carried out, marked by sectarian insults and an atmosphere of revenge more than justice, produced consequences that extended far beyond Iraqi borders. Instead of stability, the execution deepened Iraq's internal divisions and generated expansive waves that altered political perceptions throughout the Arab world. The most devastating immediate legacy manifested in the intensification of sectarian violence within Iraq. The dissolution of the Iraqi army and the prohibition of the Ba'ath Party, implemented by the Coalition Provisional Authority after the invasion of 2003, had already left hundreds of thousands of armed men without employment and with deep resentment toward the new order. The execution of Saddam, in an environment perceived as sectarian, transformed this resentment into fuel for an insurgency that would extend for years. For many Sunni communities, especially in the central provinces of Tikrit, Mosul, and Anbar, Saddam represented a lost order that, although authoritarian, had guaranteed certain stability. His physical elimination did not mean the disappearance of his symbolic influence. On the contrary, The power vacuum he left was occupied by sectarian militias and insurgent groups that instrumentalized his death to recruit combatants and justify attacks against the new government dominated by Shiites. The temporal coincidence between the execution and one of the bloodiest periods of the Iraqi civil war was not casual. After the attack against the Shiite mosque of al-Askari in Samarra in February 2006, reprisals between Shiite and Sunni communities had intensified dramatically. The execution of Saddam, far from calming tensions, exacerbated them by confirming for many Sunnis that the new state was fundamentally sectarian and vengeful. The violent statistics subsequent to the execution reveal the magnitude of the failure. During the following months, daily deaths from sectarian violence in Baghdad and its surroundings reached peaks superior to 100 victims daily. Nouri al-Maliki's government, perceived as partial by broad sectors of the population, lost credibility both nationally and internationally. The incapacity to guarantee impartial security fed the perception that it was a failed state under foreign occupation. The transformation of the Sunni insurgency into a global jihadist movement found in Saddam's execution a powerful catalyst. Organizations like al-Qaeda in Iraq, although they had been brutally persecuted during the Ba'athist regime, managed to instrumentalize the figure of the executed dictator to denounce both foreign occupation and Shiite oppression. This historical paradox allowed even those who had repudiated Ba'athist secularism to incorporate Saddam into narratives of religious and national victimization. The accelerated radicalization process by the execution created the conditions that years later would allow the emergence of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. This extremist organization exploited both nostalgia for the Ba'athist order and sectarian resentment, combining apparently contradictory elements in a destructive synthesis that would destabilize the entire region. Parallel to these immediate political consequences, the execution profoundly altered the perception of Saddam Hussein both within and outside Iraq. The official memory promoted by the new Iraqi government and by Western powers emphasized the systematic brutality of the regime. The devastating war against Iran, the invasion of Kuwait, the massive repression of Kurds and Shiites, and the criminal use of chemical weapons against civilian population. This narrative, backed by exhaustive documentation from human rights organizations, presented his execution as the necessary closure of a cycle of terror. However, popular perception was more complex and contradictory. The leaked images of the execution, which showed Saddam facing death with serenity while being insulted by exalted guards, dramatically altered his public image. For many observers, especially in Sunni communities and pan-Arabist currents, these images transformed the all-powerful dictator into a figure who died with dignity facing sectarian executioners. The invocation of the Shahada during his last moments, although his regime had been secularist and repressive with Islamist movements, reinforced perceptions of religious martyrdom. This symbolic construction was systematically exploited by insurgent groups and Baathism sympathizers who presented his death as evidence of the systematic persecution of Sunni Arab identity. In the broader Arab world, the execution generated reactions that reflected regional geopolitical tensions. In Palestinian territories and Jordan, significant sectors of the population organized mourning manifestations, carrying portraits of Saddam and celebrating symbolic funerals. For many Palestinians, he had been one of the few Arab leaders who had supported them economically during the First Intifada, and his death represented the loss of an ally in their resistance against Israel. In Egypt, the reactions were more ambivalent but equally revealing. While popular sectors expressed sympathy towards Saddam as a symbol of pan-Arabist resistance, Hosni Mubarak's government maintained official distance, conscious both of the historical brutality of the Iraqi regime and of its own internal vulnerabilities. This division between governmental elites and popular sentiment was replicated in different degrees throughout the Arab world. Even in countries that had been direct victims of Saddam's aggressive policies, the reactions were complex. In Kuwait, brutally invaded in 1990, Some sectors criticized not the execution itself, but the sectarian tone that had characterized the process. This distinction revealed broader concerns about the implications of Iraqi fragmentation for regional stability. The execution reinforced pre-existing divisions in the Arab political system. For governments aligned with the United States, it represented the necessary end of a dangerous dictator who had destabilized the region for decades. For broad sectors of public opinion, however, it symbolized the collective humiliation of the Arab nation under foreign hegemony. This divergence between governmental elites and popular perceptions weakened the legitimacy of pro-Western regimes throughout the region. The anti-imperialist narrative was reinforced by images that seemed to confirm that Arab leaders who challenged the established order would face similar destinies, independently of the legitimacy of their methods or the justice of their causes. The judicial process that preceded the execution also had lasting implications for perceptions about transitional justice in post-conflict contexts. The criticisms about lack of procedural guarantees, political pressure, and exclusion of relevant evidence undermined the credibility of the legal procedure. The realization of the execution during the first day of Eid al-Adha was interpreted as a sectarian provocation that confirmed the partiality of the process. The leaked recordings transformed what should have been a solemn act of justice into a humiliating spectacle that reinforced perceptions of tribal revenge more than impartial application of law. This transformation had consequences that transcended the specific case, establishing negative precedents for future transitional justice processes in the region. For the United States, the execution was intended to demonstrate the success of its democratization efforts in Iraq. However, the result was counterproductive. Instead of showing the triumph of democratic institutions, the event exposed the weakness of the Iraqi state and Washington's incapacity to guarantee impartial judicial processes under its supervision. The memory of Saddam Hussein remained permanently divided according to sectarian, national, and political lines. For Kurdish and Shiite victims, he continues to be remembered as a bloody tyrant whose death represented late but necessary justice. For Sunni communities and pan-Arabist movements, he became a martyr who died defying his sectarian and foreign enemies. This memorial ambivalence reflects the incapacity of the Iraqi state after 2003 to build a coherent national narrative about its recent past. The absence of a genuine national reconciliation process, replaced by logics of sectarian revenge, perpetuated divisions that continue destabilizing the country to the present. The dark legacy of the execution of Saddam Hussein transcends its individual significance to become a symbol of the broader failures of Western intervention in Iraq. Instead of inaugurating an era of democratic stability, it marked the visible beginning of a period of fragmentation, sectarian violence, and extremism that would profoundly alter regional geopolitics for subsequent decades.